Ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure to warmly welcome you today on behalf of the Warsaw office of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and also on behalf of our partners, Friedrich-Ebert Foundation and Demos Europa, whose joint efforts made this event possible. A few days ago, this room hosted a different event with the leader of the main opposition party of Poland, meeting which was widely echoed by the Polish press. I didn't count at that time, but I think this room was half so full as today. So it doesn't actually come to me as a surprise, because while discussing Europe's place in the Asian century, we are going to address probably the most challenging and most pressing issues of the international politics, at least seen from the European perspective. The rise of China, the American pivot to Asia, and the crisis of the European Union, at least these three phenomena come together as factors shaping the New World constellation, which makes the European choices more difficult and forcing us to think about Europe's place in the Asian century more strategically and beyond stereotypes. This is one of the main missions of all our institutions. It is not by accident, for the first time, that ECFR, Demos Europa and Friedrich-Ebert Foundation launch such events and such debates, which are meant to deepen our understanding of developments in the part of the world which is most probably going to have a decisive imprint on the upcoming decades. The China program of the CFR, which I dare to say is an excellent source of information and analysis of what's going on in this part of the world, has ever since closely cooperated with the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation on this topic, and I'm very happy that our office is this year on board in a project started by Demos Europa and Friedrich-Ebert Foundation last year, and offering an excellent format for exchange and expert debates. I think there are at least two relatively new developments which give this debate about Europe and Asia in the 21st century a new turn. First, it is the widely spread perception that China is on the cusp of a new phase in its history. Our ECFR colleagues and editors of a selection of essays written by Chinese intellectuals, which was published in November last year, labeled this phase China 3.0 and argued that, I quote, "Getting China 3.0 right remains the largest strategic policy litmus test for the EU. China 1.0, the Mao China, was, according to this view, a planned economy, Leninist political system, and a foreign policy of spreading global revolution. The next 30 years period, Deng Xiaoping's China 2.0, was marked by export-led growth and quest for domestic stability, as well as by low-profile foreign policy aimed at avoiding conflicts and securing economic prosperity. Now, the post-crisis China 3.0 is facing a success trap. In order to preserve the achievements of the past, the country needs to reinvent itself both in terms of the economic and political order. The new China is going out economically, reaching into the EU, defending the interest of its internationalist companies and the growing Chinese community in the world. And last but not least, the post-Deng foreign policy, likely to be both more assertive and engaged, poses questions if China can live up to the expectations of being a responsible stakeholder in the international system, to use the phrase coined by Robert Zöllig. And second, the just started negotiations about the transatlantic trade and investment partnership between the EU and the US may prove to be a game changer in the international affairs, as its importance would go far beyond economics. With $34 billion in GDP, the new trade zone would not only represent almost half of the planet's total economic output, but also set conditions for the world trade, and as many hope, serve maybe as a broader strategic purpose of shifting US focus back to Europe. It could be a new economic NATO, a Western response to its decline, and to the rise of new powers and emergence of the Asian century. I'm very happy that we managed to gather such an excellent panel to talk about how Europe should position itself towards the new shifts of power on the global scene. And I'm passing now over to Krzysztof Blusz of Demos Europa, who will introduce our guests and chair the following discussion. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you, Piotr. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. So I would start straight on without any further words of introductions. Let me introduce, first of all, sitting on the far right, Professor Bogdan Góralczyk, a Polish career diplomat, and university professor, academic researcher, prolific writer and speaker, and former Polish ambassador to countries of the region, including Thailand, Philippines, and Myanmar. Also a very well-established academic in the field of international affairs, with a specific interest also in Hungary, having been posted at a certain point of his career in Budapest. Then sitting to Professor Góralczyk's left, another personality which I have a great pleasure to welcome back to Warsaw, Professor Kerry Brown, Executive Director of China Studies Center at the University of Sydney at the moment, and also a prolific writer, speaker, an expert on China and the region, someone who has followed the steps of Hu Jintao and his life story. And I know already that there is something new coming from this part of Kerry's work, which is a new book of newly appointed President Xi Jinping, and also on the city of Shanghai. So welcome, Kerry. It's good to see you back in Warsaw. With us is also today another personality who has been following Asian issues and China issues for years, who comes from Berlin this time. It's Jürgen Stetten, head of the Asia Department of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in Berlin, who has also served in the field offices of Ebert Foundations in the region. He has spent time working in Vietnam, South Korea. He has been also all around the place in the world, working in South Africa and a few other places. He's been watching China. He's been thinking about China and globalization. He has written about it, and his work is well recognized within the China Watchers community. And on my right-hand side, Director Jakub Wiśniewski, head of the Department of Foreign Policy Strategy, a strategy guy who has been responsible for the last few days for foreign policy planning in the obviously medium and long-term perspective at the Polish MFA. He has been involved in many initiatives on the strategy planning exercises, including very recently he has been involved in the European global strategy exercise, which have been done by a number of the Polish think tanks. So entering immediately into our discussion, let me explain the rules of the game. We have around 90 minutes. I want to leave 30 minutes for the discussion and engagement with our speakers for you, ladies and gentlemen. Also, I must say that I know that there are so many personalities sitting already in this room who know about China and Asia a lot. So I'm very much willing to let you engage and have a fierce and interesting discussion. But for the remaining 60 minutes, let me do 3 rounds of questions with our speakers. And then I would open up the floor for the public. And going straight to Kerry Brown now, I would obviously like to do first some stock-taking exercise and start where we left it last year. For China, for the biggest animal in the region, this year has been incredible. We have witnessed an unusual transformation of power in China. We have witnessed loads of dramatic soap operas, including Bo Xilai's fallout of power and of grace. We have seen over the last few months an interesting consolidation of power of the newly appointed president. We have seen the entertainment industry, as I used to call it, the various public opinion outlets in China going a bit silent over the last few months. We have seen a lot of things happening in the region as well as a fallout from the apparent change of policies in China. So, Kaveh, it's job for you now, if you could explain to us what has happened to China, what have we learned about Mr. Xi Jinping, if I may paraphrase your title, and what have we learned about the new China, if there is any new China, if there is not, what kind of a new China we may see in the months to come.
Well, thank
you have 5 minutes.
Thank you.
For all this. And it's going to be like that.
The answer is yes. Okay, so I think thank you for the organisers for inviting me here today. It's great to be back in Warsaw. And so I guess I'll talk about 2-3 things: political purpose, mobilization, and then politics. I mean, a reduced elite, which is what we've got in the Standing Committee now, from it used to be 9 people, it's now 7 since last November, is curious. You would think, with all of the different kinds of negotiations, the extraordinary complexity of what China is going through and will go through as it transits to a double the size of its GDP, basically, in the next 10 years, that you would need a more diverse leadership. But in fact, to have a reduced leadership is a question I suppose we have to find an answer to. Why did that happen? I think it is a statement of political purpose, but we are still not really clear from what this leadership have said in the last year of what that political purpose is. So we know the macroeconomic objective, that is to double GDP by 2020, and the path to that will lead China to middle income status. So that's easy to say. I mean, we can see that in lots of documents, the current 5-year program, the 12th 5-year program. We can see it in provincial programs for growth. We can see that this is a rational, simple, holistic government objective, double GDP from today till 2020. But within this leadership, the 7 men with very similar backgrounds, very similar kind of mindsets, you assume, we have to see what kind of political soul they have. Well, the one that has talked most is Xi Jinping, who has just been referred to, the new party secretary, new president, new head of the military through the Central Military Commission, so he's been given a lot of power. And he has spoken most about 2 things. The first is, obviously, corruption. He spoke about that when he was appointed on the 15th of November last year, and he has spoken about it in a very particular way, but it isn't the first time that he has spoken about this issue. From when he was a local leader in Fujian province in 1990, he talked about the party needing to not just be a money-making machine, but to also be have a moral mandate. And this issue of morality sounds very strange in a party which is obviously surrounded by enormous wealth creation and temptation for its officials. And they have, I think, been overwhelmed by that temptation. And for the party to re-find its historic core, its core values, that seems to be what Xi Jinping has been trying to talk about. So when he uses the word corruption, fubai, it is a very different kind of word to the word we would think of, the OECD and other definitions of corruption, public officials using their position for private gain. It's different in this context because this is a highly networked leadership. We're really talking about a small elite at vice ministerial level and above. So some researchers, I think Kjell Erik Brogard in Denmark has said this is an elite of maybe 3,000, just 3,000 running the whole country, provincial and national level, at vice ministerial level and above. And they are highly networked. You can create links, you can create kind of synergies between different members of this elite. And in many ways, they are also, through those networks, highly monetarized. These networks are things that you can give a financial value to. The party that Xi Jinping leads has, according to its own official history published last year, 3 pillars of legitimacy. 2 of those are historic, winning the Sino-Japanese war as part of the United Front with the Nationalists, winning the Civil War from 1946 to unify the country, so those are two historic, and then the final one is to start reform and opening up from 1978. And so the reform and opening up from 1978 is the strongest leg. The historic legitimacy issues are, I think, more and more difficult to allude to. But the problem with just the final leg of making your legitimacy based on economic productivity and success as the key output is, firstly, you are absolutely politically dependent on GDP. And this is an obsessive target for government. And secondly, you are obviously dealing with a Communist Party which, at odds, in contradiction to its historic legitimacy, has become the most phenomenal money-making machine the world has ever known. More than Apple, more than Ryanair, we all suffer from that, more than any other capitalist organization, the Communist Party of China has been a source of profit. But this has become a huge problem for its ability to speak to people, because of course there is great public cynicism from what we see on Weibo and Weixin and other social media in China. And so this treacherous path that Xi Jinping has to navigate means that he must address the issue of the party's moral mandate, but there is an issue of who he is addressing. So when we talk of the core constituencies, the allies and friends of this new leadership, I think the most natural constituency that he must be talking to are provincial elite leaders, because that's the background that he and 6 of his colleagues on the current standing committee come from, and that therefore provincial leaders must be prepared for fiscal and political decentralization. I think that is the only way in which you can deliver a more efficient governance system. You can't run this enormous political entity, China, now, with this highly centralized system that you have. And you can see evidence for how this decentralization is happening through the operations of provincial state-owned enterprises, through the operations of provincial entities, and through the powers given to provincial party secretaries. They are able to operate with a little more freedom now. And so basically, when we saw Xi Jinping in Hebei only a couple of weeks ago having self-criticism, this seemed quaint and strange and unusual for us observing it, but it's almost like a management cleansing. You're trying to prepare these people to be more professional. I think finally, just on this standing committee, we can see it as a kind of war cabinet. It's highly political in its constitution and its construction, and its purpose must be to attack and smash some of the vested interest which this enormous money making has created. And therefore, we will probably understand its political spirit when we really see it take on significant vested interest which creeps into some of the great tribal political families of contemporary China. So we've talked a little bit about the state-owned oil sector, hugely corrupt, that has been attacked in the last 11 months since Xi Jinping became party secretary, but I think that it's likely to become much more intense. It's unlikely to reach former Politburo members like Zhou Yongkang, but I think it will reach some of the key figures in these state entities which have become so unaccountable and so profitable and therefore very, very political. 2 final things. On the China Dream, I think others will talk about this, but this is really an issue of mobilizing people through something which is highly abstract, and I think basically it is a tepid ability, it's a tepid attempt to really capture people's emotional commitment, but in a way which is least committed, because it's really saying very little at the moment. And I think finally, very, very finally, one conclusion we can make from all that we've seen in the last 11 months is that whatever this leadership say about their objectives being economic, their fundamental challenges and their fundamental, kind of problems are going to be political. This must be a politically orientated leadership. Their objectives are no longer just about taking economic achievements as the key benchmark for judging their success. We are into an era of a profoundly political leadership, and we have to assess and judge them according to that. Thank you.
Gary, thank you very much indeed. It leaves us where we exactly should be, in the realm of politics of China. And obviously, I would like to ask Professor Góralczyk about what Kerry has just mentioned, because I remember last year when we discussed the pre-transformation landscape of China, I remember that you were quite skeptical, if not concerned, about the growing voiced quite loudly Chinese nationalism. And when I was listening to this famous speech by Xi Jinping, when he brought about the Chinese dream, explaining how this would fit into the concept of rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, I was thinking whether this is something which is an apparent turn to conservatism, if not nationalism, or if this is just a sort of a political tactic of mobilization. Professor Góralczyk, what's your take on where we are now with the politics of China?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, first of all, for placing me far right. This is a very strong domestic, I'm well placed. So from this perspective, I'm very happy and satisfied. Second statement, that I'm also satisfied that we have the discussion about Europe in Asia, but we are not talking about Asia, but just China. For me, sinologist is a perfect choice. Of course,
this is just the first 5 minutes you have to talk about China.
However, China seems to be strongest point. When we are talking about Europe, we should talk about the European Union. When we are talking about Asia right now, first of all, we should talk about China, because if China win, China will change the world. If China will lose, China will change the world as well, in different scenario. So China counts, and one thing should be mentioned at the very, very, very beginning. We have a very famous sinologist actually placed also in Australia, Simon Leys, Pierre Ryckmans, who is a Belgian, and he is always claiming that China is the world itself. So whatever we do, we Westerners or outsiders, we always will claim something about China. China is thinking something different, and we are producing our solutions, our projections, our visions, our opinions, which are not necessarily the same as the Chinese ones. This is a very important one. Well, I just came back from China 10 days ago, and from this perspective, I tried to figure out what's going on there. In my opinion, China is in deep transition again. And this transition will be finalized later this year during a third plenary session of the Communist Party of China. Forget the name. Communist Party of China, you can use the term much better, power party or collective emperor. It's much better to use this term than instead of Communist Party of China. And as this collective emperor is engaged in another project, China has realized that the development model introduced during third plenary session of the Communist Party of China in December 1978 is dead, is over. If China would try to follow it, China will disappear or will have domestic upheaval and many problems to be resolved. So what is necessary? China needs to arrange, and here is the volume, Die Achtste Kijker, second reform. And this reform is already well prepared by the Chinese sinologists, by the Chinese experts. And what will be the final result of this second reform, we can only suspect and speculate now, but we do expect that it will be produced and announced, proclaimed in November this year, a month from now. The date is still unclear. What is this second reform talking about? That China will be first domestic-oriented, so it's not export-oriented anymore, due to the situation on the global scene. We will talk about it, I suppose, later. Second, that China, it's not only growth which counts, but also sustainable development. The third dimension of this second reform is the green or even non-coal economy. Next dimension, revival of social security net. And finally, which is the most demanding and surprising, that China would like to arrange an innovative society. And if you observe these 7 leaders, quite rightly described as a war cabinet by my predecessor, you have division of role. The Prime Minister, Li Keqiang, technocrat, the first Prime Minister of Communist China who is absolutely English fluent person. Zhou Enlai was speaking a little bit English, but Li Keqiang is the first ever English speaking person, and doctorate from economy management. He's preparing and he's engaged to produce this second reform, second chapter. They say the first chapter for 30 years, 32 years, it was, or 35 years, it was just a chapter of survival. Now we have a chance, they say, for the chapter of rejuvenation. But at the same time, we have the supreme leader, described by my predecessor, Xi Jinping, who is dreaming. He is dreaming about China dream, 中国梦. I just brought, well, if somebody and some people are familiar with Beijing, you have this largest bookstore on this corner of Xidang and Chang'an. When you go enter right now to it, in front of you, you have a bookshelf, and on the bookshelf, you have 24 positions on China Dream alone. 24 book positions. I brought only one, 学习读本, so handbook how to learn what China Dream means. So in a nutshell, I have all the China Dream in one small book. And this is serious, ladies and gentlemen, because what we observe, and I observe right now, it's another campaign, Cultural Revolution style. It's a mass campaign like during the Cultural Revolution. Well, Carrie Brown says it's for management, maybe for arrangement, but I suppose when you read it, this handbook more carefully, it is linked with another term very strongly. And this is rejuvenation or renaissance of Chinese nation. 中华民族伟大复兴. It's mixed together, two terms. Chinese dream, which is obviously against American dream, and rejuvenation, which means nothing else, just reunification with Taiwan. And from this perspective, we have a very strong nationalism revival, and very dangerous phenomenon, because there's no countermeasure for it. There's no opposition, no checks and balances whatsoever. So this is a very serious demand on the international scene, and due to the fact that my time is over, I will stop with it and maybe return to it later.
Thank you, Professor. I can see you have remained skeptical, as you were last year, but let me just turn it over to Jürgen Statten. There has been, I mean, following up on what Professor Gulazik said, there has been this this conversation of the pundits who watch China about over the last 6 months at least, or 8 months, of a serious changes to the personal style of Xi Jinping, who has been consolidating or reverting to something which for years was actually not a way the Chinese were doing things, because he's turning back to the personal leadership. And he's decided to consolidate the power of the party as a main agent now of the new wave or new stage of reforms, both political and economic, or at the expense of the state, or something which we in the West were hoping, or the liberal communities in China were hoping for, which was basically grasped by our concept of the rule of law before the transition. When you look at that from the German perspective, I mean, 100-odd years presence in the region, joint meetings of the cabinet of the German and the Chinese Republic cabinets. I mean, how do you see the changes unfolding in China? How this impacts on your perceptions of where we are in our relationship with China?
Well, thank you, Christoph. It's great to be here in Warsaw, and particularly great you didn't ask me about what the new German government will look like.
This comes, so you watch out.
But coming back to Asia and China, I wanted to would like to first remind us. You asked me about the German perception on the leadership change, and first of all, I think it was remarkable to see how much interest there was in the German media and the German public in general on the leadership change. I mean, there was a strong competition from the U.S. We had the U.S. elections, and usually if there is an election in the U.S., there's all eyes on the U.S. election. But the leadership change we saw last year, I think that was very remarkable. There was a very widespread coverage on the change in the media, and you could see that people have noticed it's important what's happening and there. And that went far beyond the kind of China watcher community. And the question is why? I think there's two strong interest points when you look at it from a Berlin perspective. The one is, of course, for the German economy, the Chinese market has been probably the number one motor for growth, the engine for growth. There is a fixation in the German business community on the Chinese market. And I think when you see the leadership change, there's a very, very strong interest in the business community that things continue as they were in the last couple of years. So continuity is what people are concerned about, and they would like to see continuation of the recent trends to kind of keep propelling the German economy. So that's the first point of view. And the second point of view, as you refer to the joint cabinet meetings, it is that I think from the point of view of the German government in the last couple of years, we have seen some kind of special relationship emerging between that the German government has been enjoying ever since, I think, leaders in Beijing realized that in the EU it has been, ever more difficult to kind of deal with Brussels. They have actually established this kind of special relationship, which puts us in a very difficult spot. But on the other hand, of course, we also try to reap some fruit from this special relationship. And again, here, the visit of Premier Li Keqiang to Germany was very important as a pointer to whether this relationship is going to be continued. And what he said there, I think, was a clear indication that for the time being, this relationship will go on. So in that, from that point of view, I would say we are probably a little less skeptical in the kind of China watcher community and beyond in Berlin in terms of the leadership change that we have been seeing, because I think we saw there were some some troubling spots with Bo Xilai and some of the things that popped to the surface. Of course, people who've been following China, they know below the surface there's always been troubling spots, but now it just popped up and people got nervous, but then they were kind of relieved, I think, when they saw it kind of calmed down. So I think generally people are not very much concerned about what they are seeing. What they are concerned, however, is more the medium to longer term view, whether or not some of the changes that Professor Brown and Professor Guralczyk spoke about, whether they will mean, continuity in the medium to long term, or that they will mean disruption. And I think I always ask people when I join discussions on China in Germany whether they believe in 20 years' time the Chinese Communist Party is still there. And you would get usually more than 2/3 in the room would answer yes. They strongly believe that it will be there for another 20 years or more. And sometimes you feel, it's also kind of a wishful thinking, because it's so hard to imagine what would happen if there would be a disruption in China today.
Jürgen, thank you for this view from Berlin and reconstruction of what the expectations or perceptions are in Germany now. But having heard that, I would immediately move to the Polish government and to the Polish MFA official, Jakub Wiśniewski. I remember when Polish-Chinese relations were upgraded to the status of a strategic partnership. We knew already at that time that was at the very last moments of the outgoing Chinese political elites and leaders. There were expectations that with the transgression completed in China, we would restart our thinking about the content of the strategic partnership. So let me ask you, Jakub, what's now the thinking of the Polish government about our relationship with China? You have been also very active within the Central Eastern European region, working with other governments on our position towards China. If you could explain to us where we are now, nearly a year down the road from the transition we started November last year.
Thank you very much, Krzysztof. I need to make a confession. First, I want to say that I'm a generalist, which means that I deal with a general foreign policy at the MFA. I'm not personally responsible for China and Chinese policy of Poland. And secondly, I'm a bureaucrat, which means that I'm eager, always eager to listen to wise men talking about developments in the country. And as a citizen of my country, obviously, I'm concerned and worried whether political developments in China might bring instability, or if there can be some economic turbulence leading up to trouble here in this part of Europe. But as a bureaucrat, I have to say honestly that things are going fine. The precedents that we have established in recent years concerning Polish-Chinese cooperation are still on the table. There is an intergovernmental committee of Poland and China coming up. We have no date set yet, but it's going to be a huge event. 8 ministries of both countries will be represented. There will be some guidelines of cooperation decided at that first meeting that will set certain precedents for the future. And also I want to mention this a very useful format of 16+1. Europe, mainly Central Eastern Europe, meeting China. It's a very useful format for Poland, but also for China. For China, maybe especially given the fact that it's such a giant, and it's good to somehow to consolidate the small fry at the other side of the table, because we are small fry from the Chinese perspective. So exciting events are coming up. Actually, 26th of November. This is the tentative date which is set for the meeting in Bucharest, where all the 16 countries will attend. There are some procedures, some facts on the ground that help the initiative move onwards. For example, there is a plan of the so-called 12 steps, and these 12 steps are about different things. For example, 5,000 scholarships given to people from Central and Eastern Europe in China to understand better the country and to establish certain ties. There is also a talk of 10 billion euro investments in the infrastructural projects here in this part of Europe. So there are lots of interesting things coming up. There are problems as usual, and these problems have to do with certain failures of Polish-Chinese communications that we had in the past. The notorious case of Kowek is somewhere still hanging over our heads, and we need to keep this in mind. So I don't want to sound too optimistic, but at the same time, as a bureaucrat, I don't see any trouble coming up.
Well, thank you, Kuba. I have to react on saying that when I was listening when you were mentioning the 16+1 format, saying that this is just a small fray vis-a-vis China, I was thinking, well, why wouldn't you do it 21+8? But that's a different thing. As promised and rightly pointed by Professor Guralczyk, I would like to move on now a bit to talk about not only China but also Asia. Asia in Asia and Asia in the world. But let me start with the question which actually goes straight to the percepted or real changes in the Chinese foreign policy after the accession to power of Xi Jinping. It seems that we have already turned the page in a sense. We have left behind the legacy of Deng. Xi Jinping taking up the office, he has immediately declared quite openly that China is a global power. That China is interested in the global matters. He has made the trips all around the place. He has visited Russia, South Africa, to African countries, Latin America. He has met immediately Obama in June this year, you remember, in this fantastic rancho in California, with a meeting which did not bring much, but still was there. We have seen Russia being called most important strategic partner. We have seen a change in the policies towards the neighbors, which has become a bit more focused, if not tougher, at the same time much less voiced in the public discourse, but we have also seen quite a lot of friction still in South China Sea. We have seen still ongoing discussions with the Japanese. We have seen quite a remarkable U-turn on the North Korea issues. So all these bits and pieces, they signal that there must be something changing, if I am right. And let me ask about this thing, starting with Professor Guralczyk, who has been also Polish ambassador to Myanmar, to Burma, has written a book on Burma very recently. How do you see the situation now in the region, Professor Guralczyk, within the context of vis-a-vis this slight changes of accents in the Chinese foreign policy? I'm sorry, I haven't mentioned Taiwan, which is also a point of your particular interest. The pressure is growing.
So important that in 10 days from now I will be on Taiwan to search on site what's going on there. What is the response for Chinese Beijing's initiatives? Well, first of all, we need to add something that China and their behavior on the international arena has something to do with the West, and especially the crisis of 2008 and what's going on right now with the U.S. shut down, the situation with the budget and indebtedness. Everything is extremely important from the Chinese perspective. Also, the messages from Europe. Europe is a crisis which is not a statement, it's a continuous situation. Actually, it's a road of development from crisis to crisis of the European Union. But now we have many more problems which are observed very attentively from Chinese perspective. So the West is, if not in decline, so in transition. And from this perspective, the 2008 was a threshold not only for the West, but also for China. Since 1991, China had a consensus imposed by Deng Xiaoping, so-called 28 Chinese characters strategy, that China need to be low profile, not to be in the first row, and not to be a leader global scale. Since then, consensus is over. In political terms, it was confirmed by Poshilai trial. In academic terms, we have at least several schools. I have no time to go into details of thinking about the future of China. We have those dreamers. We have the school which want to come back to national heritage, to ancient China and Confucianism. We have very strong nationalistic position. Actually, David Shambaugh, who published a book this year, earlier this year, and described China as a partial power, he enumerated some 26 schools of thinking in foreign policy alone in this volume. So you have a differentiation of positions and words. Consensus is over because China doesn't know how to behave on international arena. Two things are more than obvious. When Hu Jintao was leaving as the president of the country last November, he said China has two unprecedented opportunities. Number one, that China can surpass in coming days, weeks, or months, US as a global economic power. And this is point number one for any Chinese thinking. And the second opportunity enumerated, unprecedented opportunity enumerated by Hu Jintao, that China has a chance for reunification with Taiwan. And this is a second point. And they want to do it in these two terms of the fifth generation of Hu Jintao and Li Keqiang. At the same time, David Shambaugh is absolutely right. China is partial power. Transformation is not over. And China has many, many problems to be resolved. Unprecedented challenges. And the challenge number one is Chinese society and Chinese mentality. Because the terror of the Mao's era was replaced by the terror of money. The only thing what it counts in China is Beijing Zhuyi, it's money, worship. This is not a system of value which is a universal one. You cannot be a global superpower with this kind of system of values. So this is point number one. Mentality and psychology of the nation which is growing, which is powerful, which has so much and much money and more, and potential is growing, at the same time, no countermeasures for that. When you look into Chinese media, into Chinese internet, into Chinese blogs, it is something stunning. And we need to know about it, because it is existing. So, I don't want to go into details, but in my opinion, we are coming, ladies and gentlemen, to a very, very sensitive chapter of the global scene. China is emerging as a global superpower, but China is not ready internally, domestically, institutionally, psychologically, and mentally to be a number one. At the same time, US is not ready to be a number two in all these dimensions as well. So what we will have, an upheaval, maybe Kupchan is right when he is saying, well, nobody's words is coming in front of us. So we have very, very sensitive moments of history, and this is my message. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. Carrying on with this, I'm going back to Kerry Brown now. Kerry, you have been sitting in the region for some time already, very close to the unfolding dynamics there. In a country, actually, for which China is the leading trading partner. Country which has just offered the pivoting US some more space to accommodate their military. We have witnessed something which I understand when I'm listening to the experts was unprecedented, a very quick consolidation of power over the military by Xi Jinping when he was taking up the office, and there was this strong narrative of a very strong investment in the Chinese Navy, militarization of China. When you look into the region now, and let me quote the old saying quoted so often already by the smaller actors in the region who used to say, well, you know, we don't know whether the US will be with us in 50 or 100 years' time, but what we know for sure is that China will be there. How does this play now into the regional dynamic of the foreign policy of China and the foreign policy of the region?
Thanks. Well, I'm certainly looking at the government paper, the white paper produced by Australian government last year, Australia in the Asian Century, is useful. It's a paper I think it would be very hard to produce in Europe because our concept of Asia is so contested. But I think because of necessity, the Australian government has had to think about this very, very hard. And so it does give some definition and tries to give a conceptual framework to what engagement with Asia, this somewhat abstract concept, is. And I think it also avoids hedging. I mean, it comes out with some particular policies or policy proposals about what it calls creating an Asia-savvy policy-making community. And that's, I think, our fundamental challenge in Australia. I think that's something we can't walk away from. Well, with China at the heart of this, of course, China has a feeling, I think, in the elites at least, of little strategic space. This is frustrating, so it's a frustrated foreign policy mindset. And even when you think of the areas where we privilege China and say that it has great space, like with North Korea, we see a North Korean leadership which is consistently able to blackmail China. It blackmails everyone, but it certainly blackmails China well. And I would suggest that you read Andrei Lankov's very good book about North Korea, just published, an excellent book on daily life in North Korea. Which is, I think, a very good statement of how successful this North Korean elite have been at a completely bankrupt strategy. It will end in failure, but basically they have no other alternative, and they have been able to plot their way into decision-making with China, with America, with everyone they want by extraordinarily aggressive, bad behavior. So if DPRK can muck around with China, I don't think we can say that China, therefore, is so assertive. What it is, I think, is obviously frustrated. The comments about the G2, I think, are right. It does not want to be pushed into a position of taking leadership on issues which it's not prepared for. Hu Jintao, when he spoke last year at the Congress, 90% of what he said was about domestic issues, 10% about foreign policy. I think there's two things, just quickly, that are worth thinking about. China's got to do work on its alliances. It has very shallow alliances in the region. I believe you were ambassador in Myanmar. I mean, alliances come and go. Well, with China, they go very quickly. I think these shallow alliances are a problem. And the rhetoric of China's foreign policy is good. It's doing wonderful work, I think, in Central and Eastern Europe. Over the last 2 days I've been in Slovenia. China's producing Slovenian-speaking diplomats now. This is an extraordinary thing. I mean, and so putting lots of effort and resources into this soft power of diplomacy. But the political heart of these relations is still, I think, empty. There's got to be deeper alliances. And I think also, to come to the mindset issue, this idea of a status. So Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Prize winner, said China's belief in returning to a middle kingdom, I mean this mythical middle kingdom. But this idea of status, I think, is a game we can both play. We should flatter China. Flattery is cheap. Look, I'm from Britain. We have the world leaders in flattery that means nothing. So, I mean, with a leader like Tony Blair, we managed to have flattery that meant nothing for a decade. So, I mean, we can kind of, use flattery, I think, to our ends. We should take China's status seriously. We should say that it matters. And when we hear about the Zhongguomeng, the China dream, we should immediately focus on the budget of the China dream. And if it has a budget, then we can all dream together. Thank you.
Thank you, Kari. Now going back to Jürgen Stedt and trying to triangulate a bit and sort of reconnecting Europe with the whole thing. There has been quite a lot of conversation going about this new type of relationship between the US and China. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has underlined this new evolving relationship in terms of developing a new model or building a new model of major country relationship. And obviously, if it is to have some substance, it may have a very profound impact on the transatlantic relation as well. Jürgen, once you've been watching the unfolding discourse on the G2, if I may put it this way, relationship, what's your thing that Europe should be actually looking into, or how Europe should be hedging in this context?
Yeah, thank you, Christoph. I think I would agree with the previous two speakers that if you're looking at the Chinese foreign policy, I think they've been confronted with enormous challenges. And I think particularly Hu Jintao in his last month in office, he must have been really frustrated with, what has been happening and on many fronts. And I would perfectly agree with what the previous speakers have said. But I think now President Xi Jinping, he seems to have some kind of a windfall profit right now. And I think two pictures stand in my mind. One is the California meeting that you mentioned, which was, I think, a great sort of PR success for the Chinese leadership to stand there. I mean, this is the kind of the G2 picture that you see, which they produced for the domestic consumption audience to kind of address the kind of nationalism, the expectation in the Chinese public to be a great nation, which is on eye to eye looking to the U.S. And the only thing that was missing was the participation of Michelle Obama, probably, where everybody was so disappointed that she.
Not singing so well.
So that was the one picture, and the second is the picture that you could see in the newspapers today of the APEC summit, where all of a sudden the U.S. disappeared, and I think that was the kind of funeral of the pivot approach almost. If you have a major meeting where the U.S. president, due to a crisis of the budget and the political system in the U.S., is unable to be there and gives the whole scene to the new Chinese leader who could actually, dominate all the headlines with what he had to offer. And I think that was a very, very, unexpected probably for President Xi. Almost a gift from Washington to be in the limelight of this meeting without the U.S. president. Now, what does this all mean for Europe? I found it very intriguing when you listed all the things that President Xi did since he came into office, that you didn't mention Europe once. And actually, I think there is a big problem that we are facing in Europe with how do we deal with this new situation where we have a very self-confident Chinese leadership. We have a U.S. administration which is battling on many, many fronts. But we haven't also no reason for complacency. We haven't actually done our homework, I think. We haven't really come up with any. Australia has a strategy paper. We don't even have a strategy paper. We don't have any kind of clear position in Europe on where we stand when it comes to the China policy, but also when it comes to where do we stand in Asia. Are we going like hand in hand with the US on all issues? Are we going to be hand in hand due to our great trade relationship with China, or are we trying to be some kind of Switzerland in between where we have a kind of a neutral position? So I think we are not clear on really where do we stand and what is our position as Europeans, and we have maybe kind of position as EU member states, but even there it's kind of wobbly, and you could see this with the solar panel issue coming up, recently, where how difficult it is to maneuver, in this kind of unclear position vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis the new kind of rivalry that we see in Asia developing between China and the US, and that's really the show in town, this big rivalry, and all the countries sitting there kind of with their hedging strategy really to try and kind of avoid being caught by this rivalry. And I think I would agree with Professor Kowalczyk that these are very exciting times. I think as Europeans we can't afford to sit just in the kind of observation tower and watch this, because looking at the trade, as I mentioned earlier, we're very dependent on a prosperous Asia which keeps on growing, and I think we better make sure that we can contribute to a stable and peaceful development in Asia in the coming decades.
Well, thank you, Jürgen. Thank you for this, and thank you for bringing about the solar case. I think that we also have people who know about it in the room, who come from the European Commission and who were involved in the process. Finally enough, but let me ask Jakub Wiśniewski once more the question about Europe and Poland and the Asia rise. Not only in economic but also in political terms, does the rise of Asia need to be happening at the expense of Europe? That's my question. And when you said, and I already sort of ironically commented on this, when you said 16 plus 1, and I said, why not 28 plus 1, I would ask you, if it is happening at the expense of Europe, what should be the theater of dealing with the Asia rise for Europe? Should they be a bilateral, regional, or really European answer and response to it? Huh?
Remember, in my first intervention, I told you that I was a bureaucrat. Bureaucrats are boring, but they seem to have one positive thing. Their emotions are much more stable, because when people discuss the issue of China or Asia, they tend to waver between complacency and despair. Even the term Asian century brings some thrills to some people and great worries to others. And before I move on to the subject of Poland, I want to make three very obvious points, points that many people here in this room would share with me. First of all, we must understand that history of mankind knows many more Asian centuries than European or Western ones, and we need to treat it as a given. Secondly, simple extrapolation of today's trends seldom works. Asian growth or Chinese growth will not be as breakneck as today. That is something that we know. And thirdly, Europe is not as rotten as many believe it to be, also in China. Navel gazing and talk of decline seem to be unduly en vogue today. Is Asia's growth Europe's loss? My answer would be yes and no. Yes, there are things, and we have to be very frank about it, that are zero-sum game. For example, number of seats at tables, voting rights in the institutions, influence, right? Someone is influential in Africa, somebody else loses this influence because of the growth of this entity. Central Asia is a useful example here. And also, we need to remember that some resources in the world are much limited, starting from oil and gas, but going through precious metals, but also clean environment. So there is an element of zero-sum game between the West and China or Asia in general. But there can be also a negative answer to this question. Asia's growth doesn't have to come at the expense of the West. For example, trade. This is the area where we all gain. Innovation. It can be conducted not only in Europe or in America, but also in China. There can be different many motors of growth in the world, and there is also many double-sided gains from migrations. People, societies, countries are at different stages of development, so the migratory flows can contribute to economic growth. You asked me the question about this dilemma of Poland and initiative of 16+1 was mentioned. And I have to be honest with you again. There is a dilemma for Poland. What kind of channels do we use of communication with such a big country like China? Do we go it alone? Do we go it in a group of countries, for example, Visegrad Plus, or maybe we should go through the channel of the EU? And please bear in mind that we are sometimes criticized in this or that institution or by this or that country, that we sometimes pick the choice of going it alone. And my honest answer is that I think that we have to use all these three channels, of course, with some rules involved. So whenever we have a summit of 16+1, it's good to have President Barroso on board or President Van Rompuy. It's good to tell honestly our partners from France or Britain what kind of ideas we have in mind. Actually, everybody does it, right? Germany, France, these are wonderful, powerful countries that have their own channels of communication with China. So Poland should not be blamed for our own efforts. I think that it's a matter of diversification, and also it's a matter of honest communication within the European Union. The rise of Asia or China brings a lot of dilemma for a parochial country like Poland, because let us not pretend that we are a global power. We have only started to become a fully fledged member of the Western family. We have joined NATO and the European Union, and now we need to, once we made this step, actually this elusive West is disappearing before our eyes, because it appears that the West is not as potent as it was in the past. Some members of this community are making some pivots to different regions of the world. So it is a problem. It's an existential question. And I think I don't want to spend too much time on that, but just to finalize, let me say that I think it can be done. You can be you can be a member of a Western community through values, and there are some things that are not negotiable. For example, the rule of R2P, responsibility to protect, or human rights, democracy. These are things that are given for us, and we will not budge on that. But at the same time, the Western model has many flaws. Polish model has maybe some some different flaws than other Western European countries, but we all can take example from Asian countries, starting from Vietnam, ending with Thailand. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Kuba. Let me now enter into the last round of questions, and this were actually thought about by me as going back to some economic aspects of what we have been witnessing over the last 12 or 18 months. And there are three things which come to my mind, which I believe are worth commenting. One is this massive expectations which the world, if not the Europe and America, had a year ago, which were concerned with China rebalancing its growth from investment and export to more domestic consumption, and embarking on a massive task of various reforms which were badly needed, as we have read in the famous report China 2030, championed by actually now Premier Li Keqiang. The report, which was a very ambitious plan of a second way of reforms in China, which was prepared within the mode which was surrounding the last 5 years plan. And it seems that all these expectations are at the best on hold, because as some authors and China watchers would claim, it seems that unfortunately there is not much happening, and the current leadership does not have concrete plans or hasn't revealed yet concrete initiatives to go down this path. That's one aspect of the story. Can we really believe that China can rebalance? And I don't want to quote too many authors here, but Michael Pettis recently is actually arguing that the only way is actually to privatize, to basically move the assets and actually the wealth from the state-owned sector towards the households. But let's leave it there. The other very interesting aspect of what's going on in the economic realm is something which many people would call new China expansionism or new China export ambitions. Obviously, it is concerned with what we have been witnessing, which we have been trying to understand what is the scale of the exercise, but simply China buying companies, exploiting natural resources, building infrastructure, giving loans all around the place in various countries. And I don't want to quote the very particular projects which are of a scale which is really sometimes breathtaking, like building, for example, 200 dams across the planet, or becoming not only a leading exporter but also a leading trading partner for many countries over the last few years. So I would start with Professor Guralczyk and actually ask you, when you are watching what has followed the Chinese go global strategy or tactics from a few years before, where do you find us? And how do we meet with China in various parts of the world?
Thank you. This is crucial, and I suppose nobody's sleeping at the room, because we have several, at least I'm a former ambassador, not a current ambassador, so I will be blunt. First, two comments which, to my mind, are very crucial to comment what Director Wiśniewski has said. One thing about the Western domination. Well, it is true that the Western domination we observed at least since Columbus and Magellan. But when you look into China, China is an ancient civilization. When you go into this handbook of Chinese Dream, already on the third page, you have the comment to your statement concerning the Western domination. What they say: Egypt, Old Babylon, India, and China were the ancient civilizations which emerged as the first. And immediately thereafter, among the four, China obviously was the brightest and the largest one of them. So for us, China coming back and emerging as a power, surprise, we are stunned, we are not expecting it. For them, it's a return to ancient times where they are teaching at their schools. This is number one. Number two, you mentioned Europe is not rotten. Well, let me arrange, I said I will be blunt. I also arrange a small commercial break. During vacation, I prepared a volume which will to be published in November in Polish, earlier next year in English. And the title of the book is The European Union, Federation or Fragmentation, interrogation point. And And if you don't believe what I don't want to go into details, because in my opinion we have several simultaneous crises, starting from the crisis of leadership. Germany, where is Germany? Polish foreign minister was asking already 2 or 3 years ago in Berlin. Where is the German leadership now? And what kind of leadership of the grand coalition in European affairs when Chancellor Merkel is tight-belt arranging policy, and the Social Democrats have completely different opinion concerning European integration. And I could go into details even to my favorite Prime Minister Orban. But let me show just one title of the European magazine, and you have all here. A renationalization is emerging on the European continent. So what kind of message it is for the Chinese from this perspective? So, answering your questions, I will be brief here. In short term, like it or not, we will have a Chinese expansion. We are already witnessing it. Instead of trade alone, we will have Chinese banks, Chinese investments, Chinese rare earth, even, to use the other term from the other speciality, Chinese capture and storage will be here. But for the long term, on both sides, of the European side, European Union side, and on Chinese side, we have domestic tasks. The Chinese need to create a new model. If anyone knows what will be out of it, you cannot predict, because China is a continent, and it is so difficult to pronounce something that there will be a second reform, second chapter of reform. But it is a continent and mentality of 1 more billion plus inhabitants. So China is slow. Second, we on the European side have also a domestic task. The only answer of ours is to have a common foreign and security policy and common strategy towards China, which is lacking, as it was mentioned already. And especially China, which is growing and expansionist, with a new kind of expansion already visible even here in Warsaw. Are we ready for it? I doubt it, and I will stay with my doubtness. Thank you.
Thank you, but we will stay with your call for the common foreign security policy. Now switching to Kerry. Kerry, just to highlight a few things from where you are staying right now on the antipodes. In Australia, Chinese accumulated investment in 2012 surpassed 50 billion. Direct investment in Australia in 2012 increased 21%. And so on and so on and so on. That's one side of the reality. God knows how to look at it, because you need to put this into context. But at the same time, I mean, let's start with your take on what's going on in economic thinking. You said that doing something with economy will be the primary objective, obviously reached by political means as well. But is really China 2030 in the dustbin now? Is rebalancing in the dustbin now? What's going on in China?
Thank you. Well, as I'm living in the world's most beautiful city, I'm going to be very optimistic. You can't really be pessimistic in Sydney. And so I am pretty sure that we can be partners for growth, because we've said it enough, so I think we can do it. And the markets in China, India, Indonesia, a huge potential market, are ones that are there for us to conquer. And they are huge potential places for our services, and they are also potential places for our high-quality goods. There is no sort of, I think there's no prejudice against foreign brands in China in terms of people being happy to buy foreign. I think this is a great opportunity. So if we have the right conceptual framework and we see China as a number of markets and we have the right strategy, there's plenty for everyone to share. And when we look at what Li Keqiang's fundamental proposal is, well, he says fast, sustainable growth. And he said that for 2 or 3 years. before he became premier. So he's talked about 4 spaces for growth internally. So from 2008, the Western markets have failed. They have not delivered the kinds of export returns that China needs for fast, sustainable growth. So he's talked about 4 spaces for growth a lot, where there are structural problems in the Chinese economy that are widely known. Low consumption, so we can be allies, our companies can be allies for China in creating a higher consumption. Low urbanization, although it is urbanizing, of course, has urbanized a lot, that urbanization has got to increase from 50% now to 60, 70%, and that journey in the next decade will have huge social and economic consequences. He's talked about high capital investment, it being too high, something like 46, 47% of GDP, and this is really the role of the state being too overprivileged. That needs to decrease. I mean, in America it's about 16%, and he's talked about increasing service sector. So his figure in 2010 in the party theoretical magazine Qiu Seeking Truth was China has, I think, 45% service sector. A developing economy has about 54%. Developed economy has 70, 80% and upwards. So those 4 structural problems are things the policymakers can address. And the thing that we are most interested in concentrating on is this issue of the sustainability agenda. Because I think there's consensus amongst policy-making elites from the China 2030 document, produced with great criticism within China last year. 1,600 Chinese economists across China criticized the book and said this was Wen Jiabao, who was the primary patron for the document, although really Li Keqiang was the main executive patron between the World Bank and the Development and Reform Commission. So basically they criticized this paper for being a sellout to Western neoliberal kind of economic hegemony, and said that this was giving up on the Chinese vision of domestic reform. But I think, in fact, that is not the consensus view. The consensus view is that the sustainability challenges in China are very great, that efficiency must be the future, that attacking vested interest is part of that efficiency agenda, and that as long as we can demonstrate that we are partners in that delivery of efficiency, then we are relevant and we can speak to that agenda in our own interests. And so our companies are allies for consumption, but we are also allies for sustainability. And I suppose we therefore need smart policy. We have smartphones, we have smart systems, we need smart policy. One very final comment on the idea of policy hedging. Well, when did policy hedging ever work? I mean, when did it ever work? People instinctively know if you are ambiguous towards them, and if your policies are in such a way that they signal that they are hedging, then I don't think that we can get away with that. We have to, at the end, make a kind of commitment. Well, we have a wonderful position in Europe, and I think we have a wonderful position in China, because while our political elites will complain and moan and make every kind of excuse they can to do nothing, they will be forced to do something. This is good, because I think that means that there is clarity. Like Hegel, the great philosopher, said, understanding begins on the ledge. You look down and you decide whether you're going to live or die. So I think that this elite will have to make this decision, and I'm sure that they will make the right decision. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Curry, for this dash of optimism, finally, for living it there.
You need to be in Australia.
Right, but you need to be in Australia, apparently, for this. Lucky Sydney. Jürgen, let me ask you, and I will be drawing on what Curry has just said about being in a partnership for sustainability with the Chinese. Which is a very actually catchy phrase, and it depicts very well where we are actually in the boat. But having said that, I mean, I have put you into this role of explaining to us German views today, but I hope you will forgive me this. But when you look at the trade balance between the EU and China, you would definitely see that the first person you need to ask about what's up is a German panelist. 50% of the EU's exports to China leave actually shores of Europe from Germany. When you think about this tension between being a partner in sustainability, because it also actually is a big chunk of German economy, the exports to China. At the same time, you are well aware that China has been moving up the value chain in what they produce, what they manufacture, with their investment in innovation, research, also in acquiring technologies via takeovers and mergers. We still have the well-known problems in China with the access to the market. We've had the famous solar panel case where Germany was a serious actor. And I wish we had Commissioner de Gucht here with us. He would explain to us the dynamics behind. But also when you think about the new landscape unfolding through the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which gives a new context to our relationship with China, and what is happening right now in the South Asia with the APEC summit and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, another massive initiative which creates the context for our trade relations and economic relations in the future. How do you think we could reconcile the tension between being partners in sustainability and actually being on a very serious competitive war, if not a war already?
Well, thank you, Christoph. First, let me say what a pleasure it is to sit next to an Australian quoting Hegel and a Polish asking for German leadership. So that's very special.
You see? This is the fifth wave of globalization.
Well, on your question, I think a couple of points to add to what previous speakers have said. Perhaps first, where is the Chinese economy heading, and what does this mean for the European trade relation with China, and also perhaps Germany's trade relation with China? I think I would like to add perhaps two facets of what Kerry Brown and Professor Kowalczyk have talked about, and the first is what I would call the emergence of a Chinese welfare state. I think what we probably will see is when we talk about rebalancing the economy, we'll probably see two aspects here which will shift the focus a little bit to consumption. And when we hear about consumption growing or potentially growing in Germany, we all think about, Volkswagen sales numbers and things like that. But what I would probably expect more is that you will see quite a dramatic increase in kind of social policy measures and welfare state style elements in the Chinese economy, which would, be a major boost to the consumption as a percentage of GDP. What that means for exports, I don't know. I think a lot of this rebalancing towards consumption will probably not dramatically affect the export opportunities. Maybe not as much as some hope for, but I think it will dramatically change the kind of economy that China is having maybe in 20 years' time from what we have right now. And the second one is, and that's a second facet, is I think we'll see, as we had seen with the Asian tigers economies 2-3 decades ago, a dramatic increase in wages in China. And that's also part of the official policy. It's in the 5-year plan. But I think right now it's still a little difficult for the Chinese government to implement this kind of wage policy. But when you see that even the Japanese premier now talking about some drastic measures to force Japanese companies to increase wages, you will probably also see the Chinese leadership finding ways to increase the wages in the Chinese economy. And I think both elements will have quite a dramatic impact on the general economy in China. And will this have a positive or negative impact on trade relations? I think both. I think what we will see is we will see new opportunities coming out of this, restructuring of the Chinese economy, but also new challenges, because higher wages and more social security expenditure means there will be a lot of pressure on Chinese companies in the competitive world marketplace, and that will push them, to the higher value chain products, as we already see, and that will, make competition fiercer in some of the market segments where European companies are very active. So I would fully agree with what was already said, that for us, I think in Europe, when it comes to trade policy arena, we better make sure we're speaking with one voice and we are united, because what we're likely to see is a rather fierce, marketplace when it comes to industrial goods and some other arenas. But there's also another area where I see a lot of potential, and this is what you mentioned already, the sustainable development area. You mentioned solar panel. This is probably just the tip of the iceberg, that we have a huge market out there on renewable energy technologies, which the Chinese will move into. And I think this is probably a great business opportunity opening up for European companies, but for Chinese companies as well. So I think I don't see a sort of necessarily a kind of a major deadly trade war emerging out of this, but it will certainly be a tough time ahead when it comes to trade relations with China in the coming years.
Well, thank you, Jürgen, for these. And you have talked about actually something which Europe has been doing quite well. Actually, trade policy is this particular domain in which we are good, despite all the ups and downs with specific cases, obviously, because this is a massively complicated area. But Jakub, if I may ask you a slightly wider question, because when you think about the position of Europe within this changing landscape now, with Asia rising, because Asia is not only China, we still need to remember these. And there will be more countries coming. There is a second row of the countries which are already changing the competitive landscape for Europe as well, whether we like it or not. I mean, this is very discursive, and Foucault would explain to us whether we like it or not. If things have changed around us, we got changed, although we may not like to accept this very fact. But when you look at it, is there any lesson we could draw from this? Is there something we should change in the European social model because of a rise of Asia? Is there anything we could actually do to respond to Asian growth and Asian rise, both in Europe and specifically as well in Poland?
I want to make a few remarks about Europe and then move on to the Polish case and end with some recommendations for Poland, as I'm a practitioner. And when talking about Europe, I think that it's an obvious fact that Asia's growth and China's growth is one of the main objective reasons for or in favor of European integration. We might not like it. Our societies might not be ready for this Eurozone governance, common foreign policy, common security policy, maybe European army. But this is what objective economist, political scientist will tell you when he or she looks at the map of the world with China on it. Again, we might not like it or not. Our political class might not be ready to do this, to make this leap of faith. But this is something, for me, an obvious reality. Secondly, when I talk about Europe or the European Union, it seems to me that it's necessary for Europe to make its own pivot to Asia. And I know that it's just a slogan, but let me give you an example. Look how favorable the situation of America these days is. They are a revolving door. On the one side, they have TTP. On the other side, they are negotiating TTIP. So they are in the position to play one against the other. And the question that I'm posing to you, why Europe should not be in this position? There are many arguments that would point to the European universality. In many ways, we are engaged in less confrontation as regards China. In many ways, believe it or not, we are more powerful than America, given the fact that we are larger market of consumers. We have a lot of winning export companies. So we could be establishing standards, regulations for example, electric cars, together with the Chinese, or at least make a point to Americans. Look, we are not totally dependent on you. Transatlantic community is something absolutely important, but I would point more to the issue of values, of common roots, etc. But as regards the interests, as regards making money, I'm not so sure that we should be blindly looking only at America. We should have our own partnership with the Chinese as well. And now to move on to end with some arguments about Poland. I talked many times to my fellow diplomats, and some of them would cry real tears because they have to close an embassy here and there. And you can be complaining about this, but still Poland is not that rich country to have a global network comparable to that of Britain or France. So whether we like it or not, our global policy will in a way be limited. But let us not move on to despair, because there are innovative ways to go around this problem. Of course, we don't have to have everywhere in the world embassy. We can have the so-called roving ambassadors, a person who is based in Warsaw, but he or she moves to Mongolia on a regular basis. We can have, we can ask EU delegation to undertake some work for us. We can have a Visegrad house, where there is one embassy for the four Visegrad countries. I mean, there are lots of ways, but we just need to understand that the time for our parochial policy only concentrated on Central Europe and in the European Union is gone. Whether we like it or not, we have to go global, but still we will not, we need to make our resources work for ourselves. And well, let me end here. Maybe I will come back in the discussion.
Thank you, Jakub. Ladies and gentlemen, I've done my bit. This is your turn to make it really interesting now and to grill the panelists. So the floor is open now for your questions. I'm going to be really tough on you. Each person will have 1 minute only to share the comments, thoughts, and to ask questions specifically addressed at the panelists. And please do introduce yourself and associate yourself with the institutions which you represent if you do so. Okay, Professor Roman Kuźniar, I would introduce Professor with a great pleasure. University of Warsaw, the Chancellery of the President of the Republic of Poland. President's Advisor.
University of Warsaw, thank you, Christian. Well, Asian century, if it ever happens, will happen for the first time in the history. Because if we refer to somebody's century, European century, American century, we obviously have in mind global order, global scene, not just European century in Europe, not American century in America. International global order has been created by us, by the West, by Europe, not by China, not by Egypt, not by somebody else. So my question is, to what extent possible Asian century, if it ever happens, I have some doubts, to what extent it will influence international global order, the one that we have created? Why I have my doubts? Because Asia, even Eastern Asia, is much more fragmented, much more divided than us, than Europe, than the West. I remember Amartya Sen, who once questioned the idea of Asian values. Asian values, he said, nothing like that does exist, because we in India, we have different values than they in China. So to what extent, so the first doubt, and the second doubt, how this may happen, 18th century, if China, Asian superpower, is being more and more tightly contained by its direct neighbors, and it's going to be even more tightly contained by with the little help of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Let's take two more questions. Gentleman right behind Professor, and then a gentleman at the back on your left-hand side.
Józef Nizik, European Studies Unit, Polish Academy of Sciences. I have a very brief and simple question to Professor Guralczyk, referring to your information about this Chinese dream. What about ethnic tensions in China? Did Chinese see the problem, and how do they want to cope with it?
Thank you, Professor, and gentleman.
Krzysztof Beryski, Collegium Civitas, University of Warsaw, and former ambassador of Poland to India. I'm very thankful to Professor Guralczyk for mentioning India, but I'm sorry he just quoted Chinese. Now, I think I would wish to ask, how do you see the role of India in that arena? I do feel that values-wise, Europe and India are much closer to each other. Shouldn't we counterbalance the growing influence of China with sort of focusing on our cooperation with India? Why don't we, for instance, we have abdicated so far as the problem of Islam goes, we have abdicated to US completely, while the European civilization and Indian civilization are the best, the most experienced so far as dealing with the world of Islam goes. So this is one problem, but generally I feel that India's interests and European Union interests should sort of come together, and this would be a very good counterbalance to the growing influence of China. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's try to respond to the first questions which we had. And there was one question which was directly addressed by Professor Guralczyk about ethnic tensions. But let's start. I think I will ask Kerry Brown to respond to what Professor Kushner was saying, that we have already witnessed, as I understood it, a big farewell to the Zelix saying about China being responsible stakeholder, and to what extent actually the Asian century would influence global order if it ever happened. And this is, I understand, the question which Professor posed. And also, if you could, do it in one already respond whether actually China-centric or Asian-centric could happen in a situation when Professor Kushner alluded China was actually being contained by the neighbors at the pivoting US. Huh?
Very quickly, I mean, there's obviously great policy complexity because of the different actors and the different partners, and so, well, if you talk about something abstract like Asia, Northeast Asia, these are complicated things. When you look at what the EU has actually talked about, so the document in 2006, EU and China Closer Partners, Growing Responsibilities, is actually a really good framework, and even better because it happened 2 years before the economic collapse. So it talks about 5 key objectives, and I think that those are actually, you can replace China with a number of countries across the Asian region and you still get a workable policy framework. So supporting China's transition towards a more open, plural society, sustainable development, especially in energy, climate change, international development, trade and economic relations, strengthening bilateral cooperation, and supporting and promoting international and regional cooperation. So 7 years ago this was stated, and now I suppose it needs to be more deeply implemented. The three big sticking points with China have been the arms embargo, market economy status, and trade disputes. Well, the good news is I think the arms embargo becomes less and less important. Market economy status is cured by WTO in 2016, so that goes out of the window. Trade disputes, we refer to the solar panel dispute, but that was resolved. It was tough, but it was resolved. So I think we're really hard on ourselves. We love beating ourselves up. It must be our Catholic past, maybe. You know, we like to always be saying how guilty we are. But I say, and to say from Britain, this is a hard thing. For me, to say from Britain, the EU is not guilty is a tough thing, because we always are the spoilers at the party. But I think basically about China, I agree with what's said. We are not guilty. Europe is doing the right thing. It's doing a good thing. It's doing a necessary thing. And there are really no alternatives to what we're doing, both with China and with the Asian region generally. Okay?
Gosh, this guy must be from Sydney or something. Thank you, Curry. Jürgen, let me ask you this India question. Is this something which we have given up on? Is this something we should be actually rethinking and reviewing India and the possible rise of India in the years to come as an option to rebalance or our relationship with China?
Well, thanks. I think you, Ambassador, hit a very important point. Looking at India, Europeans, we always talk about the biggest democracy on this planet, and we kind of naturally seem to draw from this. There is a huge potential for cooperation and maybe even for balancing China. But the reality, unfortunately, is a little different. From my maybe narrow-minded experience, we're really battling when it comes to, establishing relationship with India in a very meaningful way. If we compare it with the relationship we have with China. And if you just take the micro view on the work of my organization, the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, we have a very, very broad and I would say dynamic program of dialogue which goes between China and Germany and Europe. And it covers all aspects from security, human rights, economy, social development. When we look at the program we have with India, it's very, very tough. We hardly find any issue where we get a very, very strong response from our Indian partners. A lot of the work we're doing in India is mainly, on domestic issues. And this is because there is very little interest on both sides, I have to say, to dialogue, to work together. And so I would say in theory, yes. And if you listen to the big speeches when the Prime Minister of India visits Berlin and so on, it all sounds nice. But when you look at the micro level, I think it's really a very hard relationship, not much harder than the relationship we have with China. And I think partly that this also has to do because I guess India is also battling with the kind of position that they are in at the moment. They know they're a very big country. They want to do better. They want to play a more meaningful role. But even in the if you take, for example, the BRICS context, a senior Indian professor, he told me recently that India is almost fed up with the BRICS format because they see it as a vehicle for China to domesticate the others. So they don't really want to participate in this forum in a meaningful way unless they kind of can participate on an equal footing, but they don't know how to achieve this. So I would have my doubts in a way about kind of a balancing strategy from a European point of view using India, even if we wish for it.
Thank you, Jürgen. And now we're going to Professor Guralczyk, who's got this question about ethnic tensions in China. And if I recall, there are 50 million of people in China who cannot communicate just because of the language diversity. Not to mention there are far more of people who cannot communicate because they disagree on issues. Well, Professor Guralczyk, if you could explain to us what's your take on where we are with these ethnic policies in China now?
Shortly and briefly to 3 questions, but first of all, the question to myself concerning the ethnic issues. Well, it depends whom you ask. If you ask the Chinese official, he will immediately raise the term Chinese nation, 中华民族. And Chinese nation, to their minds, is Han Chinese, Chinese 100%, Tibetan, Mongolian, Hui, so Muslim, and Manchurian. So, altogether, this is 中华民族. There's no ethnic question officially in China. Question resolved. But of course, and to follow the line, Kubilai Khan or Genghis Khan was not a Mongolian emperor. He was a Chinese emperor, first of all. And you need to keep it in mind. On the other hand, of course, we have the Uyghur question, Tibetan question, some of them very serious ones. But unfortunately, I just was in Kansu, which is also minority-dominated province of China, and they are buying it. They are buying ethnic nationalities, buying ethnic minorities by enormous amounts of money. For how long is another question. But until now, with some few exceptions, it works. For how long is a huge question mark. Now to Professor Kuźniar. I suppose we will agree that, first, American domination and Pax Americana is over. Also that unipolar moment is over, which is actually a task for us Europeans, not to watch across the ocean, but to do our domestic work right now for ourselves. But it doesn't mean that Pax Sinica is emerging. Pax Sinica is not possible for several reasons. Number one, China is not prepared and the Chinese transformation is not over yet. Second, China has not produced a common universal system of values. What is produced is Chinese, not for India, not for Russia, not even for Myanmar. When they were trying to impose something in Myanmar, we have a democratic revolution, some kind of that. So, there will be no Pax Sinica, don't worry, and this is an optimistic, finally, statement from my side. There is no chance for it in immediate future, especially, and this is my reaction to Professor Birsky, who is rightly fighting for India and his domain. I know for sure that if I want to have some entertainment concerning China, to read about Chinese transformation and reform, I'm not searching for American documents or even Australian, so optimistic. I go to India, and there's the harshest possible treatment what's going on domestic scene in China. So from this perspective, it was obvious for me from the very, very beginning that forget all these BRICS conclusions. Look at the last summit of BRICS in South Africa. They agreed nothing. Common bank, headquarters, currency, Chinese yuan. No, nothing out of it. Because for BRICS, there's only one glue. Anti-Western platform. If there will be no West, and we will arrange it, there will be no BRICS and no Chinese century as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. I don't want, but anyway, let's take, I think, one or two more questions. Alex Berkowski of the University of Pavia was already raising his hand. Yeah, Alex, can you have a microphone? This will be 2 last questions, actually.
I'll be very brief. Thank you for giving me the word. Just something maybe that Jürgen Stetten said earlier, and trying to follow up on or trying to conclude for him what he was beginning to say when you said it's not really a question but more of a comment, I suppose, is that sure, we have the APEC meeting now in Jakarta. Obama's not there, and Xi Jinping is there. So China is there, and the U.S. is not really there. And China finds itself, as you say, in the limelight, and China is the big actor. So far, so good. I mean, politically, symbolically, very important. But what about the substance? Is China going to find itself in the limelight and then coming up with proposals, instruments, and ideas that could shape such a summit and policies beyond the summit? Or is China finding itself in the limelight, not really knowing what to say? That is also following up on what Kerry said. Does China have the instruments to be number one, to be a leader? Or is China finding itself in the limelight without really wanting to be in the limelight? Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And now we have one more question from the gentleman in the second row.
Mieczysław Starkowski, Civil Defense Review Monthly Magazine. Well, our today's topic is Asia, and you have nearly totally focused on China, and well, a few words on India. Okay, but I'd like to ask you, don't you think that don't you notice that there is some kind of Muslim terrorism, for example, the issue of Iran in Asia, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you for this. So we go straight to Jürgen, because that Alex actually addressed you immediately, asking whether China had instruments to lead, whether China was ready for the prime time. I mean, we've already asked this question, I'm afraid. There you go.
Well, I think you're insinuating that they don't have the instruments, and I would agree with you. I think I would agree also with what has been said on the podium, that we're not very likely to see the Asian century, in the sense that we have an Asian leadership which comes with its own kind of development model or norms which are very different what we have seen in the Western dominated era. We also, however, will probably see that some of the values that we put up in the West, we may not want China to embrace too much. Take, for example, the responsibility to protect. You mentioned this. Do we want China to embrace the responsibility to protect doctrine and use it for intervention in its own region? I'm not so sure. I think they will have a hard time to play on the international scene in a responsible manner, given all the problems that they face on the domestic front. However, what I think, there is a great desire for the Chinese leadership to stand in the limelight and to show to their domestic audience that they are in charge, that they kind of able to project the power that they have economically as a great nation to the world. And they want to do this in a kind of low-cost way, probably, which is not, putting them into a lot of pressure. And if you want to get good examples how they do this, I think North Korea is a very good case where, behind the scenes, I think the Chinese leaders really battled very, very hard to avoid another humiliation on the North Korea front, and they're quite happy with what they got right now. But there's no guarantee for them to continue this policy in the next couple of years. So I think they're looking for the kind of the cheap, easy, low-hanging fruit on the kind of grand podium of world diplomacy, and avoiding the tough leadership issues such as Syria and the Middle East, and use the old kind of rhetoric that they have been using, don't intervene, don't mess in other countries' affairs, and so on. And of course, there is a big contradiction in this.
Thank you, Jürgen. And the last response before we conclude, and let me ask you, Kuba, the question. This will be a zooming out exercise and taking up really high-flying attitude. Apart from China, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, there are some other parts of Asia as well which have been a major concern for ourselves over the last few years, starting with Afghanistan, Iran. We have an ongoing situation in Syria, a Muslim world, Pakistan. How do you see Europe positioning against these issues now?
Even if I'm a pro-European bureaucrat and I believe in the European integration, I have to say that I am doubtful about Europe's capability to go further than its direct neighborhood. I'm sorry to say, but I don't see the crucial role for European Union in Afghanistan. This is where NATO and America step in. It's not necessarily a negative vision, because Europe can do a lot of good in North Africa and Caucasus and Eastern Europe, and that's enough for now. And let me conclude with one general reflection. As you wanted zooming out, here it comes. The question about the universality of a Western model. I think that we are at a very difficult stage of our development as the West. How to convince others, Chinese, that democracy is best when India is struggling in terms of economic growth, in terms of very messy political process, and China is speeding ahead. How to say that intervention, for example, within the framework of R2P works best for the countries when countries where we as the West intervened are struggling to come back to health. It is difficult, even if we believe, if it's in our DNA, this conviction that we know what we are doing. It's going to take a lot of persuading with the Chinese that our solutions are the best.
Well, thank you, Jakub. Ladies and gentlemen, I have completed my assignment. I'm handing it over now to Knut Detlefsen, who runs the Warsaw and Polish operation of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, for the conclusions. Knut.
Well, obviously, I will now explain to you what all this meant. That is my job. But what I want to say, I would like to say thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. And I would like to say thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We obviously believe that Poland is a very important player in making European policy and in making European foreign policy, and this is why we specifically wanted to have this debate on Asia and, well, to a large extent then also on China here in Warsaw, to have real, like a strategic debate, and we would like to continue in the future such debates. 2 years ago we organized a debate on China, and we will continue, I think, such events, because I think it is very important to talk on global issues, and not only in European issues, also here in Warsaw. And we hope that we provide for that a platform for further understanding what's happening in other parts of the world, obviously, that are important to us in Poland and to us in Germany and to Europe as a whole. It is, of course, now when you talk about a complex, not region, a continent, an idea, like Asia, in 2 hours in the afternoon, it leaves you somewhat unsatisfied, I believe. But I think it is very clear, and this is why we organized the debate, that Asia is of strategic interest, that we have a geopolitical shift, which is because of the very unclear role the US is going to play, not only in Asia, but in general, of course, very undecided. But I think there are a few things one can say, and being fair, I think the US's stronger focus on Asia should not be understood as something confrontational, but rather as finding a way to to manage affairs in Asia together with others in a creative way. That's how at least I see it. I also would see, if you talk about China and talk with China experts, you never have any agreement where China is going, but it's fair to say that China is ongoing a transition, and there is something in China, I would say, that is wanting to be a leading civilization, whatever that then means in details, and that they have more assertive leadership aspirations with sometimes probably unclear strategic goals. But if we look at that, I remember Jürgen Stetten and I organized, like in 2005, a conference in Shanghai where we had the question, China moving from the engine room to the driver's seat, which was, in my opinion, one of the more interesting conferences that we have done as the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. And it was very difficult at that time to get Chinese officials to accept the notion of being in the driver's seat. And I think this is now not a question anymore. And this is something very clear. It's probably very unclear where the journey goes. Anyhow, I think for Europe, Asia is of strategic interest, China is of strategic interest, that is clear. Probably we need to work hard. We have a strong dialogue with China and with different Asian countries. That is very important. That needs to be continued. That needs to be deepened. That needs to be more creative. We have not touched in this panel, this is maybe also something worth mentioning, on them. Could you maybe switch this off? That would be really helpful. It is, I think, important to say that there are very severe and very difficult conflicts in the region, which we have not touched upon. Mentioning North Korea would be only one, but there are many others. And this is something, I think, where Europe could maybe play a constructive role, not in military means, but in diplomatic means, in working on these conflicts. So I leave it there. And I hope that you will stay in touch with us. We are all in the net where we publish papers on these questions. So check out our websites. All our organizations have very interesting publications on the matters where you can read more about what has been discussed. We are also on Facebook. Please check us out there and like us if you want to. We like that. And continue coming to our events, because if you like us on Facebook, you will always be invited, obviously. And I wish that we have more such debates like this here in Warsaw. And I thank you very much again for discussing here with us. And I thank you for coming to our debate. Thank you very much.